we are now going to move to our annual macroeconomic keynote session, which I know is always a highlight for everybody because we're going to start by taking a bird's eye view of what's going on. This is always one of the favorite sessions, and I'm actually delighted this year to bring somebody to the stage who's supported Aviadev since inception. Martin Jansen van Vuuren has moderated panels at events in the past. He moderated and supported us when we first launched in Kigali in Rwanda in 2016. He's a brilliant economist who was involved in the economic impact from the World Cup in South Africa and so many other tourism, huge mega events. And he also delivers destination development plans, and he understands the full value chain and the importance of the stakeholder relationship. He's also a little bit of an av geek, so that's good. That's definitely going to help today. So I'm going to welcome Martin up to the stage, but I'm going to ask him to walk very slowly so Susie can play a bit more beautiful music. But please welcome Martin to the stage.
I think I should leave and just listen to you for the next half an hour. Honorable guests, esteemed guests, also any guest that doesn't fall into that category, you are all most welcome, and thank you very much for this opportunity. Today, I'm going to talk about macroeconomic issues. There are various issues that affect the aviation industry, but there are far better experts to talk to you about things like the size of your aircraft and so forth. I'm an economist by training, so what I will attempt to do is to give you only one opinion rather than two or three on what would happen with these indicators. And also, it has been said that economists have been created in order to make people that predict the weather look good. So if none of these predictions actually pan out as they will, please forgive me. So just a couple of things, and let's start off with a year of change. 2024, half of the world's population is being affected by some kind of election. Now, coming from South Africa, just been there, we've just had our election. But if you look in terms of the countries that we are talking about, India, 1.4 billion people. The USA, we'll hold the election later this year, 340 million. Indonesia, 278, and so on. Pakistan, Bangladesh, Russia, Mexico, all more than 100 million. When we look at Africa, Wikipedia tells me that in Africa, in this year, 18 of the 54 countries in Africa is going to have either a general election, a presidential election, or a parliamentary election. Now, apart from the change in governments, in South Africa, we now have a government of national unity that's going to be put together after one party, the ANC, have been in power for since 1994. It brings change, it brings new regulations, and so forth also on the impact on aviation industry. But also things that's interesting, and I'll talk about the South African situation. In South Africa, the rand to the US dollar has been trading close to 19 rand to the US dollar for a very long time. At the moment, it's trading closer to 18 rand to the US dollar, simply because the international community and how they view what's happening in South Africa. But the impact of that is, if you're a South African airline and have got expenses in US dollars, that makes a real difference to you. So the world is changing. Crude oil. Crude oil, one of the big elements in terms of cost for the aviation industry. And when we think about crude oil, most people think about OPEC. But what's important to understand as well is that the USA is now the biggest oil producer in the world. The USA now produce 22% of the crude oil in the world. Now, according to the Energy Information Administration, it's the graph here on the left hand of your screen, They believe that due to geopolitical changes and some restrictions in terms of OPEC, that the oil price will go to $88 a barrel. But that coming up in terms of next year, it will go down to $85 a barrel, and that goes along with increase in oil production, which is the line rather than the bar on that graph. On the bottom, just another economic opinion. Luckily, they agree. In terms of the long term, the oil price, the trend seems to be downward. When we look at the economic growth, this is a heat map. It's from the Economic Intelligence Unit. And when you have a look at it, anything that's more red in color is the higher economic growth rate for 2024. And when we look in terms of the colder, obviously far less. When we start maybe in the US, there's plenty of economists that have predicted that the US economy would go into recession. The US economy has proven to be quite resilient. So in terms of that, they're talking about political risks. The election in the US will be quite interesting at the end of the year. But in terms of from an economic point of view, it is recovering. Europe very much in that blue zone. I've seen figures recently about the GDP per capita of UK and Germany, which are actually declining. So in relative terms, people in the UK and Germany are actually getting poorer, if you measure it by GDP per capita. Countries that are growing strongly, India. India is forecast to be one of the fastest growing major economies in the world. And then, interesting enough, this is from the Economics Intelligence Unit, and we looked at the graph of theirs saying that they believe the oil price is going to go down, but in true economic fashion, on this graph, they believe that a spike in the oil prices from Middle East conflict could lead to a global recession. I disagree, but then so most economists do. In terms of Africa, if you look at countries within Africa, here Ethiopia and Uganda are looking in terms of strong economic growth. Again, coming from South Africa, a bit disappointing in terms of the type of growth that we have seen, but we are hopeful. This is when we look in terms of a bit of a longer term forecast, going to 2029. The line that's on top, which is in blue, is sub-Saharan Africa. So what does that tell us is that even though the growth is not dramatic, there isn't any significant dramatic changes from 2024 to 2029, the growth is pretty constant, but it is higher in sub-Saharan Africa than the world average, the average for Latin America, the average for major advanced economies, Middle East, Central, and even the European Union. So in terms of growth going forward, we're looking at pretty standard, nothing shooting the lights out, but at least the good news is that in sub-Saharan Africa, we're looking at higher growth than the world average. This is when we look in a little bit more detail, and this is from the Africa Development Bank and their forecast until 2025. So East Africa, when we look at in terms of from a very small growth in 2023, going to quite so much stronger growth in 2025 of 5.7%, and that being the highest throughout the continent. The rest, in terms of North Africa, Central Africa, and West Africa, around the 4.7, 4.5 level. Southern Africa, however, is a bit disappointing in terms of the growth, only looking at 2.7% in 2025. And we've got to keep in mind, in terms of Southern Africa's economy as a region, very much driven by what's happening in South Africa, and the growth in South Africa, the economic growth has been quite disappointing. We make up new words like load shedding in order to say we've got rolling blackouts. So, if we go into a little bit more detail, this is the detail of the African Development Bank forecasts. So we've got real GDP growth, we've got inflation, We've got the current account balance and the fiscal balance. Now, in terms of these numbers, just because they're in red doesn't mean they're negative. They are being color-coded in relation to one another. So when you look in terms of the real GDP growth numbers, for example, the ones in green are the ones which are 6-7%. If you look at the ones in yellow, they are around 4 or 5%. And then the red is anything from 3% down. Now, in terms of those countries, you'll see there's a couple of ones that are in green, which are growing off low bases. So in terms of that, we've got to keep in mind in terms of what's happening within a country. They might be recovering from a period of unrest, war, whatever the case may be, and they're starting to grow. If we look at some of the more notable and the bigger economies in Africa, Ethiopia growing at 6.7%. There the concern is the inflation rate at 18.4%. Kenya growing at 5.5%. Inflation reasonable in terms of an emerging economy, around 5.8%. Mauritius growing well. Mozambique, 5.2%, with a 4.8% inflation rate. Rwanda, looking good at 6.7%, one of the higher economic growth rates. Tanzania and Uganda, other notable ones. Do not want to go too much into in terms of the ones that are not performing well, but in terms of the future, as I say, we are very hopeful. This presentation, by the way, will also be made available, so if you're looking at the data. This graph might be a bit busy, but let me explain the significance of what you're looking at. On the x-axis, the bottom one, horizontal, is the 2022 GDP per capita in US dollars. Now, this is all for all 54 countries. On the y-axis is the population of each country. So each country is plotted according to their GDP per capita as well as their population. Now, what that provides you an indication of is in potential market for outbound travelers on airlines. When you look at the size of the bubble is international arrivals to that country. Now, the number is all arrivals. When we look at South Africa, for example, we have got plenty of cross-border arrivals. I acknowledge that. Unfortunately, I didn't have the data for all 54 countries in terms of just air arrivals, but this is something that can be added to it. But there's a couple of interesting things. First of all, the green box is what I could refer to as a unicorn zone. You've got a country that has got a high GDP per capita, so people with money, a large population, so many people with money, and also there's lots of tourists going there. So you've got market both ways in terms of flights. Unfortunately, for this type of analysis that we've got and the size of it, not anybody in that zone. When we look at Nigeria, large population, but not so far in terms of the GDP per capita, and the size of the bubble also not that big. Bigger size of the bubble, Egypt, South Africa, Morocco. So in terms of that, when we look at Seychelles, very far to the right in terms of the GDP per capita, but the population not that big, and also in terms of the size of the bubble, not that big. What I did try to do is, in order to make it a little bit more expansive, is to exclude the countries with a population of more than 100 million, and then countries with a GDP per capita greater than $6,000. And so you'll see Seychelles is not on this graph. I was trying to see if I can expand this a little bit more. And countries that pop up is Tanzania. So in terms of Tanzania, Kenya, and Algeria. Now, just to take you back in terms of economic growth, for Tanzania was projected to be 5.8%. So Tanzania, in terms of the size of the bubble, where it is, size of population, an opportunity there. Namibia, when we look in terms of maybe a smaller population, but it is to the right in terms of the graph, in terms of the GDP per capita, and also in terms of the size of the bubble, looking at that. And Namibia, according to Africa Development Bank, projected to grow at 2.9%. Morocco, 3.6% growth projected. So you can see in terms of the kind of relative to one another, what the countries are looking at, but also what you could have a look at this is in terms of the size of the aircraft. This is where the other experts might come in terms of saying, well, in terms of we might have a bigger plane, and in terms of the frequencies, looking at that type of thing in terms of that. So there's just a little bit of indication in terms of where potential opportunities may lie. This is the Visa Openness Index, and this is an index being compiled based on whether a visa is required, or visas is required on arrivals, or a visa is required before visiting. And this is comparing Africa to openness to other African countries. So this is not visas to the UK, to the US. This is within Africa. So within Africa, Benin, Rwanda, Seychelles, and Gambia are the only countries that do not require any visas for any African visitors to that country. So in terms of that, the visa openness, the point that I wanted to make is that we looked at a couple of case studies. The World Travel and Tourism Council did some case studies and found that during 2015, Indonesia, they had a 30-day visa waiver for 169 countries. It led to an increase of 24% in terms of their tourism numbers. When we look at India in 2014 and 2015, they introduced the e-visa system, and that resulted in an increase of 21% increase in terms of their visitor numbers. Mexico, they liberated the visa system, made it more open between 2010 and 2011, and their increase was 17%. Now, as you see, there is evidence in terms of if you open up your country in terms of visas, that there's an increase in numbers. And given that we're in Namibia, I had a look at the World Travel and Tourism Council also has got a tourism satellite account for Namibia that they do. The latest one that I had available was of 2022, and they calculate that in terms of the foreign spend in Namibia was around 5 billion Namibian dollars in 2022 by foreigners. Now, if you increase that by 20%, that's another billion Namibian dollars that can be added simply by going the route in terms of opening up the market. So in terms of air access, I understand in terms of this sometimes what people struggle with, but airlines struggle with, but it definitely is to the benefit of a country. And I once heard somebody say, you know, a billion here, a billion there, and pretty soon we're talking about real money. So it will add up. Right. And then my final slide. I just wanted to leave this because I found it interesting. I do a lot of segmentation work for the various studies that I do. And segmentation is a difficult thing because you've got to find something, what are the common factor between people? And usually it's where are they from? Are you a US citizen, a UK citizen, or whatever? Or how old you are you Generation X, a millennial, whatever. And then people get categorized, and it is believed that people then act the same because they either come from the same place or the same age. Now, value graphics is by a man called David Allison. I'm not punting his services at all. It's just in terms of I found his research interesting because they've literally done over 1 million surveys in 152 languages in order to find what do people value. Because the argument is that your age might change, you might go live in another country, and people from the US don't always act the same, neither do people that are of similar age, but your values stay the same. So this is the summary in terms of in the regions, what are the top things that people value. And certain things are common across the world. Religion, spirituality, financial security, personal growth, things like that. The only thing that's not in the top 10 in the world, but is in the top 10 of Africa, is patience. Yeah. If you've ever dealt with any bureaucracy in Africa, you will understand why. But here's the thing, why does it matter? Because patience, if people in Africa value patience, ask yourself, when you are marketing a particular product to those people, will it work if you say, buy now, the offer is expiring, buy now, you need to do it now, you get discount now? Or would it work if you say, we know you're going to need to visit your family over December? Buy your ticket now, pay it off, by December it will be paid off. Patience. Just something to think about. And that, ladies and gentlemen, I believe is my time. Thank you very much.